Hello, everyone. I'm Jim Garrison, and I want to welcome you to Humanity Rising. I want to frame our conversation today by just recalling for a moment our 12-day program around the Conference of Parties in Glasgow, COP26. I think it was universally agreed, both by governments and certainly by the climate movement, that the main achievement of COP26 was basically to kick the can down the road and not take the kind of action that was required for the world to keep global temperature rises under 1.5 degrees above pre-industrial levels. As one of the panelists on Humanity Rising said, at COP26, a certain kind of hope died. And that was the hope that our governments were actually, in the end, going to do something in a meaningful way, given the overwhelming consensus around the world by climate scientists everywhere that we are in, as the IPCC put it in August, in unprecedented territory, which the Secretary General said means code red for humanity. But as one hope died, another hope was born, and that is the climate movement. And I would say more broadly, the progressive movement, because now we know that it's up to us, that no one's going to save us except ourselves. And that's stark in a certain way, but it's also profoundly liberating in another way. And so what we want to do 10 days or so after the ending of COP26 on November 12th is begin an exploration about how we as the people of the world take in both the gravity of the current crisis, but how do we empower ourselves through direct action to make the kind of difference we need to make in order to either turn this thing around, which is still remotely possible, but still possible if the kind of action is taken within a very diminished time frame. How can we even think about that? And so over the next weeks and months, we're going to be spending time reflecting on this question. Now that our governments have kicked the can down the road, what do we do? What do the people now do? And how can we do it in a way that actually makes the kind of difference we all yearn for? So that's the subject that we want to embark on today. And we're going to have a dialogue with someone who's probably thought more about this than maybe anybody out there, and has demonstrated through what he's done as one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion that it is possible to organize a group of people in diverse nooks and crannies of society, commonly concerned, commonly motivated, to come together with a coherence of purpose and action, that a real difference is transacted. Before we engage in our dialogue with Roger, let us pause, as we always do as we begin Humanity Rising and all the hustle and bustle of our world, to just take a minute and take a deep breath and center ourselves in our bodies and attune ourselves to our hearts just for a minute. Attune yourself with your heartbeat in a spirit of gratitude and deep thanksgiving that you're alive. We're all alive at this most extraordinary moment in the human journey. Thank you, everyone. It's always a good thing to start with a coherent heart, particularly when you have to discuss matters of gravity and consequence about our current situation in this world of ours. I want to bring on Roger Hallam now. Roger, if you open your video and turn your mute off. We want to talk with Roger for the next hour and a half or so. Roger has been an activist for many years, but really, I would say rose to prominence as one of the co-founders of Extinction Rebellion in late 2018, that came into formation in a very dramatic way with a strategy that actually worked. To galvanize public attention, not only in England, where it was principally focused, but around Europe and around the world, to our climate crisis, and has continued to be active. And Roger has continued as a public intellectual to articulate the imperative for direct action at this time. So we thought, as we begin our reflections on what comes next, given the failure of COP26, it would be probably optimal to bring Roger on, and he kindly accepted our request. So thank you so much, Roger. And I think the best place to begin, just so people get acquainted with you, would love to hear a little bit more about your background and what led you over your years of reflection and action to co-found Extinction Rebellion and conceive the strategy with others that made such a dramatic mark in the global conversation about climate.
Yeah, thanks very much. And yeah, we finally get a time to talk. Sorry about the, I think we had about 3 attempts, didn't we, to get a time.
That's okay, third time's the charm.
And I've just been in a long strategy meeting, so I had to extract myself. So I'm lucky I'm here, really. Yeah, so thanks very much for having me on. In terms of my background, the fact of the matter is I've been thinking about how to effectively change society for the better as a sort of lifetime obsession ever since I was a teenager. So that's really what I think when I get up in the morning and what I think about when I go to bed. And that's just the way I am, it would seem. So there's a certain involuntariness to it. I was in the peace movement as a teenager in the 1980s. So that's where I cut my teeth in terms of being arrested, going to prison, what have you. I went to London School of Economics for a year, but then I dropped out to do full-time activism. I was involved in the cooperative movement for about 10 years. And then when I was 29, I became an organic farmer. So I spent 20 years doing organic vegetable growing, bring a family and such like with many farmers from the beginnings of the 2000s, it became evidently clear that the climate was changing, and that became ever more dramatic with, extreme weather events happening every 2 to 3 years from the mid 2000s. That incidentally led to me not being able to continue my business. I lost hundreds of thousands of pounds due to extreme weather events, along with millions or hundreds of millions of other farmers around the world. But the truth of the matter is, I was broadly aware of the catastrophic risk of the climate crisis, independently of what's happening to me as a farmer. And to cut a long story short, I went back into academia when I was about 50. I'm 55 now, and I did a PhD research at King's College on effective direct action, civil resistance, civil disobedience, whatever you want to call it. But really, that was a systematization, as you might say, of the work that I'd been reading about and studying and thinking about and practicing for the previous 30 years. And I spent most of that 5 years on the front line of campaigns, studying what works, how to do organization, mobilization, framing, direct action design. So it's the nuts and bolts of what we have to do to save ourselves, I would suggest. So that's me.
What came about? Tell us about the founding of Extinction Rebellion. What were the causative factors that led you and others to found it? Tell us that story.
Well, it's the realization of total failure. That's the truth of the matter. And you have to understand that failure is a great teacher, and innovation and creativity and success comes out of failure. So failure is not a failure in that sense. But the fact of the matter is, like 3 years ago, a bunch of academics and activists and such like got together with the realization that carbon emissions have gone up globally by 60% since 1990. And if that's not a catastrophic failure, God knows what is. But we didn't come together to sort of to indulge in self-pity or recrimination or judgment. We came together in order to ruthlessly analyze the roots of that failure and what the jumps of faith and courage, as you might say, to engage in the intellectual work that will create a mobilization that will reduce carbon emissions significantly. That's the job. And Extinction Rebellion came out of around 1.5 year process of study, reflection, prototyping, so that when we did launch Extinction Rebellion, we pretty much knew what the errors were. We pretty much knew the elements that we were going to introduce. And we presented that to the world, to the climate movement, to the journalists, to the recruits as a take it or leave it package. We weren't going to negotiate with the dysfunctionalities and failures of the climate movement up to that point. And for me, like, the key element here is understanding that we have to fundamentally reassess what we're doing. And if we don't, then we're all going to die, or rather our children are going to die. And it's as serious as that, as everyone knows. So that was the process. I mean, I can talk to you about the ins and outs of what the deal is, if you like.
Yeah, would very much. In particular, because we're in a time where we have to engage in what Mikhail Gorbachev calls ruthless realism. So I'd be very interested in the analysis that you collectively came up with around both what were some of the failures and what were some of the solutions or the action set that you discerned with such conviction that it became sort of a take it or leave it. Lead us through that thought process. I know it's intricate, but that's
Yeah,
worth considering, because we're in the same moment now where the environmental movement has to, in part, take some of the responsibility for where we collectively now are.
Yes, and particularly after COP26, I think the ruthless sort of point to make is that the primary reason for the failure to reduce carbon emissions rests with the climate movements themselves. And that's a very harsh thing to say. And obviously, you can be defensive about it and say, well, that's ridiculous because it's the bad guys that have done bad things. But the issue here is there's always bad guys and they're always doing bad things, right? We've had 5,000 years of human history. The locus of agency, to use a posh word, the point at which change happens is not with feeling miserable and judgmental about what the opposition does. The first step towards success is to focus upon where we have agency. And where we have agency is in movement design. So this is one of the catastrophic failures of progressive movements and the left generally over the last 30 years, is a fetishization of defeatism. The world is terrible. I'm so clever in describing to you how terrible the world is, and then that's the end of the article. Like that's the culture of defeat. It's the culture of appeasement. It's the culture of avoiding responsibility. The first thing that we need to understand, if we're going to get ourselves out of this hell, is to focus on ourselves, what we are going to do, what I'm going to do after this call, what we're collectively going to strategically create. So that's not taking away for a minute the acknowledgement of all these terrible people doing terrible things. I'm simply saying that's not the focus of our attention. The focus of our attention is on our own structures, our own culture, our own philosophy, our own spirituality, right? Our own complicity, our own fears. If we don't do that, then we're just going to go into the gas chambers, with a great analysis, but we're still going into the gas chambers. That's the fundamental point here, right? Analysis means nothing without a concrete path to action. And there's three fundamental failings, I think. I mean, don't get me wrong, I haven't got like I've just written 3 things down on a piece of paper, right? So if you ask me tomorrow, I might come up with a slightly different formulation. But here it goes. This is a good enough to go analysis. And incidentally, good enough to go culture is what this is all about, right? We're not dealing here with, we're going to spend the next 5 years trying to study what the 3 core problems are. We're coming up with 3 good enough problems, and then we're going to deal with them. So in no particular order, like the first problem is the problem of politics, that the climate movement is enmeshed in a reformist, progressive left sphere, which jealously protects it. And it's in contradiction with the ontological nature of the problem. In other words, the crisis is not a crisis of politics. It's a crisis of social dysfunctionality. In other words, this thing is going to destroy everything. It's going to destroy what conservatives believe in, what liberals believe in, what radicals believe in, and what all the people who don't believe in those ideologies believe in. The closest analogy to this is the struggle against Hitler. So, a little case in point is when the resistance movement started in France, it involved conservative Catholics working with Republican socialists. Now, if you know anything about the history of France, you can understand that those two political and cultural forces were at each other's necks, right, for 150 years before 1941. Why did they come together in 1941? Because they believed and they knew that Nazism was a complete violation of all human values. And what we're dealing with the climate crisis is the violation of all human values objectively, the destruction of humanity forever. So we have to, this is what Extinction Rebellion's first move was to move out of that narrow politicization, which should not be confused with an absolute dedication to equality and justice and humanity, right? But it's over and above the identity trend of politics over the last 30 years. And every time that we try and create some functionality globally, it tends to be undermined by that narrow identity politics. Now, I want to emphasize, I've got no problem with identity. I'm making a nuanced point, right? That identity is essential and inevitable, but it doesn't have to become toxic. In other words, I'm a Methodist, I'm white, I'm a man, but that's not the end of my identity. My fundamental identity as a human being has responsibility to continue life on Earth. So those two things go together. So that's the first major problem, right? Is it gets enveloped into the culture when you see that, of course, in America in a massive way, and also, in the UK. The second major problem is the fetishization of rationality. So most people in the climate movement are from a very narrow demographic, culturally, spiritually, and socially. They're on what you might call the rationalistic Western middle class. Now, the rational Western middle class has a lot going for it, right? We've made massive advances through the Enlightenment tradition, medicine, social services, technology. Unless you're a total extreme sort of back to nature type, everyone understands that. However, that culture is now dysfunctional, because how you're going to mobilize people en masse is not through rationality, but through action, through emotion, through identity in struggle. In other words, what we need is Larry Kramer's, not like Michael Mann's, right? No disrespect to Michael Mann. We need people who can stand up and say, holy fuck, what are we doing here? You see what I mean? Like, I did a talk at COP, and I started my talk by saying, why is it no one at COP has used the word fuck, right? It's not like I'm a swear every 2 words guy, right? But there's times in life where you need to say fuck. And what I mean by that is there's times when you've got to lose it. And everyone knows this from their family relationships, from their social relationships, right? There's times in those relationships you have to actually engage with your whole emotional, spiritual being and go into explicit rage. That's not the whole story, right? It's not like we're putting aside our intelligence, far from it, but we need to reintegrate. And what that practically means is we need to bring normal people into the public frame to talk about the climate in everyday language of ordinary people. So for instance, in Insulate Britain, there was 2 people, an electrician, a single mother, and they were working class, and they got on the TV studios and they gave them hell, right? This wasn't the chief executive of Greenpeace. And that's what's created tens of millions of conversations in the last 6 weeks in the UK. And unless you're creating those conversations, you're not even on the foothills of the massive political, social, cultural change we need. So yeah, I'll stop there, I think. Oh no, yeah, civil resistance.
2. There's a third.
Yeah, I know, it's late in the day, so I've been in the meeting all day. So the third thing is civil resistance. In other words, if you're going to save the world in 3 to 4 years, and according to Sir David King, the former chief scientific advisor of the British government, who's, the top 100 scientists in the world, Sir David King is up there, he said in Australia earlier this year, we have 3 to 4 years to determine the future of humanity, which is repressed euphemistic English for billions of people going to die, right? So that's the actuality of the situation. There's nothing in the literature of social change that even approaches the functionality of civil resistance in such situations. And that has to be dogmatically asserted. This is not a matter of opinion any more than the Arctic's going to ice by the mid-2030s. There are absolute rules of thumb in terms of social science, right? And the social science is absolutely clear. You are not going to change the society without civil resistance. The only other competitor is terrorist violence. And we all know that that's massively problematic, both morally and also socially. So what civil resistance means is something concrete. It's not a take it or leave it, smoochy sort of vague notion. What civil resistance primarily means is that people disrupt their society economically and socially day after day until they're either killed or they're in prison. And that produces a backfiring effect, which brings more people onto the street to replicate it. So a little example, for instance, is with Insulate Britain, we had 120 people go on the roads, a very small number of people. It's based upon the Freedom Riders. As many of your viewers probably know, the Freedom Riders started off with 24 people, 430 people in Parchment Prison in 1961, and they got a win. So this is one of the important things to understand about civil resistance. It doesn't start through a consensus building process. It starts through the howl of rage, which then translates into the willingness to do whatever is non-violently necessary, come what may. And what those people did is block the motorways, and within 4 weeks, 77% of the British public had a name recognition of Insulate Britain. That's the fastest name recognition process in recent British history. Why? Because they blocked motorways. But the more significant issue here is that that produces the backfiring effect. Right? 10 people are now in prison, maybe 30, 40 more people will be in prison. Now we started off with 5 people doing mobilization. Now we have 60 people. 60 people is enough to create 1,000 people prepared to go to prison. That's how it works. It's iterative and it's exponential. But it has to have those elements. It has to have the willingness to massively disrupt your society and the willingness to take the consequences and to be done with nonviolent discipline. Those are the core elements. And just to emphasize, this is not a movement of movements process. It's a process of individual consciousness, right? A few people decide they've had enough. And it's happened over and over and over again. And you're seeing this at the moment in Australia. One of my best friends went to prison this morning for a whole year for blocking the coal depot, and they all build. And maybe it won't build, in which case we go extinct. But the point is, unless we do that, unless we do this, it won't build, and we're certainly going to go extinct. That's the conundrum here. So please, all the intellectual people listening to this is not an academic discussion. It's the kids are burning to death on the top floor of your house. Do you go in the front door or don't you? We don't have kids burning. You see what I mean? We only have limited options. The option of doing nothing is the option of extinction. The option of going through NGO mobilization is the option of extinction. The option of civil resistance gives you a 25, 50% chance of winning, right? That's all it is. So which one do you go for? You don't say, well, civil resistance has only got a 25% chance of happening, so I'll just sit on my arse. Sitting on your arse equals 100% chance of extinction. You see what I'm trying to say? That's the deal in 2021.
Of course. Well, and the history of direct action, let's just take Gandhi and Martin Luther King or the ANC in South Africa, arose, I think, from a very similar analysis that you've done, where they came to the point of view to realize that nothing, unless massive civil disobedience, was sufficient to transact or even open up the possibility of whether it was independence for India or the liberation of South Africa or civil rights in the United States. So I think what you're saying is based on essentially the history of social movement over the last several centuries, right? I mean, this is, you're
Yes,
deeply immersed in
think
this
you're
history.
right, and I think you're right, or you're 50% right, let's say. I think you're right in so much as we have a really clear idea of how this process works,
Right.
which is there's an injustice happening, and people for a decade or two or several decades go through the process of increasing frustration. They write letters, they speak to their representatives, they have public meetings, and there's a tipping point where they realize that it's not going to happen. And there is a tipping point continually, there's a number of different tipping points, right? It's not necessarily one particular moment. We see this, for instance, with the COP26 process, as you were saying in your introduction, it's like the death of hope. It's not the death of hope in the sense of, this thing can't be sorted. It's the death of hope of privileged reformism. That's what's died at COP, which is business as usual, NGO, lobbying, day marches. It's not going to work because it's not going to work. But what I'd like to propose to you is the moment we're in 2021, is fundamentally not the same to ACT UP or the civil rights movement or the ANC or the suffragettes, in one catastrophically different character. And that is, everything is now going to be lost. You understand what I'm saying here?
Absolutely.
We're not losing the civil rights movement. We're not losing the right for women to vote. We're not losing another few decades of apartheid, right? What we're losing here is the whole damn fucking thing, forever, objectively, according to the world's best science. That completely changes the moral, emotional, spiritual context in which we find ourselves in. And this potentially has two consequences. It means that the moral imperative to go into civil resistance is technically exponentially and infinitely more strong than any other struggle in world history. In other words, you simply do not have the choice as a moral agent not to enter into civil resistance because of the infinity of evil that we face. That's the first thing. That's the moral point. And the sociological point is that when people realize in their hearts, as you say, that this is the moment of infinite evil, you will find a vast potentiality for millions and millions of people to go into civil resistance in a matter of weeks. Because we know this historically, that how civil resistance works is it's radically non-linear, and it doesn't always work. But when it works, a few people go into resistance, they either got shot or imprisoned, and then more people come out onto the street. And then it happens again, and a government falls. What we're looking at here is the same process, but on steroids, if you see what I'm trying to say, right? And it's a global process. What I predict will happen is millions of people will come onto the streets in the next year or two, engaging in civil resistance over 2 weeks, very, very quickly, because so many people are desperate and so many people are utterly, utterly horrified by this ultimate transgression of all human values. And really our job, my job, your job, the people who are watching this call, our job is to maximize the probability of that happening as soon as possible, because we have an absolute deadline. After 3 to 4 years, it will take a year or two. Whatever humanity does, we're going to functionally go extinct. That's the reality.
Yeah. Roger, let's talk for a moment about the experience of Extinction Rebellion in terms of applying the strategies of disruption, because I think you're right. With Insulate Britain stopping the motorways, describe for our global community exactly what Extinction Rebellion did during that 2018, 2019 period, because I think it's such a useful model for the kind of direct action that's available for people to do, which, if done well and with nonviolent discipline, can actually have a major effect. But give us the details of that story and that strategy.
Yeah, those classical civil resistance has a very sort of clear model. And I want to say at this point that everything, all the work that myself and Extinction Rebellion have done is really standing on the shoulders of giants, Martin Luther King, Gandhi, but also standing on the shoulders of the civil resistance episodes that have been going on every year or two in the global south for the last century. And this model that we've accepted, as you might say, brought into the global north, is the occupation of the capital city. It's not particularly complicated, as 2 or 3 key elements. And it's not the only game in town. There's the motorway methodologies, a number of other methodologies. But this is what you might call the main show. It's a bit like with labor disputes. Everyone knows there's a whole bunch of things workers can do, but everyone also knows that the main show, sociologically, politically speaking, is the labor strike. You withdraw your labor. And the reason it's the main show is because it maximizes the probability of success over a whole bunch of iterations. So it's the same really with how to get functional structural change in the society and or overcome a regime. And the elements are as follows: like thousands of people go to the capital city. They engage in disciplined non-violence. They block the roads and they do so day after day. And if they do it in sufficient numbers, which is something between 10 and 50,000 in a medium-sized country, then if they continue doing that for, let's say, 10 to 20 days, then they will, other things being equal, bring the government to the table. So, it's not complicated, right? It's like the labor strike. Labor strike is very effective, but it's not complicated. People stop working for their bosses. And what we did in 2019 was 10,000 people went to London. They stayed, I think, for 12 days. They engaged in non-violent discipline. There were 1,200 arrests in those days, and it produced a massive explosion of realization that the climate change crisis is real, and that enabled us to talk to politicians. We basically won the argument in the UK anyway, that this thing is real, it's coming down the road. No one disputes that anymore, apart from a very small fringe of people. It got us meeting with the politicians. The British Parliament declared a climate emergency and such like. So what that did was create a massive empowerment that broke through the social repression. So what it's important to understand is the reason people aren't mobilizing against the climate is not that they're not terrified. People are terrified. The problem is there's no pathway to congruent and credible action. In other words, people don't want to go on a march because they know a march doesn't work. But if they see thousands of people getting arrested in the city and it starts to work, then thousands more people will come down because it will break through that repression, that despair, depression and what have you. And that's how it works in the global south. Everyone hates the dictator. Everyone wants to get rid of them. No one wants to make the first move. And then there's a tipping point when everyone realizes, oh my God, if I go to the streets, there's a possibility we're going to win. And millions of people go on the streets. And if that's the structure, there's always this tipping point. So the project going forward is to replicate that in various different ways. And what we did post-COVID, obviously COVID sort of destroyed that mobilization because it's very difficult to organize and or go to the streets during the COVID epidemic. But coming out of COVID, like hundreds and thousands of people around the world are now preparing to go into this civil resistance process again. And what we'll see as a more vigorous and full-on version of it, as you might say, with people going to prison and what have you. And at some point, as Gandhi predicts, you've got the ignoring stage, the laughing at you stage. We're entering now the fight stage over the next 2 years, and you will see classical civil resistance working in Western democracies.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Oh, let me probe some of the challenges, and I want to raise, for example, the Arab Spring, because that's an example of where you had the tipping points, you had more and more people, eventually tens of thousands, and it was sweeping various countries in the Arab world. But almost without exception, what came in the aftermath of that was not any kind of liberation, with the possible exception, I think, of Tunisia, but more repression. So, what would be your comment on the Arab Spring as a social phenomenon? Why do you think it failed? Because I think one of the truisms of social change, as we see in the French Revolution or other social revolutions, is that sometimes when revolutionary fervor breaks out, all kinds of forces then enter the fray, and you can end up with the Bolsheviks, as they did in the Soviet Union. You can end up in places that nobody really expects. So, speak to us, Roger, from your experience as to how, once the movement has cracked things open, one can work in a concerted way to assure a particular outcome, because it doesn't always happen that way.
Yeah, well, I want to reply to your question with a sort of rhetorical question to you, which is, why did you ask that question? What we have to understand about human questioning is every question has an assumption. Every question has a hidden agenda. Every question presupposes a certain frame. And what I would like to suggest to you is the frame of what happens afterwards, and maybe it will go south, is the frame of global north middle class privilege. In other words, what people are, I'm not directing this necessarily at you, I'm making a generic point, right? And the generic point is that the privilege comes from the notion that I'm in a position to make a choice. I'm not going to go on the street because there's a possibility or a high probability we're going to end up with the Bolsheviks or some variation on the theme. That objectively is not the situation, as I said. The situation is you're going to end up with the Bolsheviks or worse anyway, right? You're anyway going to end up with totalitarianism. You're anyway going to end up with social collapse. So before I can answer that question, which in itself, of course, is perfectly respectable, we have to interrogate what's happening in the psychology of asking the question.
Yeah.
You see what I'm trying to say?
Yeah, absolutely.
So the other thing, before I answer your question, is this notion of historical determinism, which happens all the time, which is people cherry pick an episode from history or a particular iteration and go, Roger, this happened like this. And then the assumption is a purely mechanical relationship between the present and the past. Now, that's just bad social sciences, bad historical analysis. What we can say at the most is that a particular historical episode has a bearing on the present. It doesn't determine the present. In other words, if something didn't happen in the past, that doesn't determine that it won't happen in the present because it's complex, right? But there's a more fundamental point here, which is, to reiterate what I just said a minute ago, which is this moment is not just another moment in history. And as another moment in history, there's full of indeterminacies, as you might say. It's fundamentally, metaphysically, spiritually, politically, socially different to any other moment in human history. So we cannot only vaguely associate the dynamics of a historical episode with this moment. And that's why I'm saying that at the moment of extreme injustice, extreme infinite evil, the human dynamics of mobilization are going to be nothing like the mobilizations in another historical episode. That's my proposition. Now, having made those two sort of premises, I will now respond to your, half valid point, which is that revolutionary activity, civil resistance, whatever you want to call it, has a tendency to not go well. So the first thing to say, of course, is, so what? Right? What's the alternative? Because the default alternatives, as we've established, is we're going to have social collapse anyway. So what I would suggest to you is the practical design problem here is how to minimize the probability of social collapse coming from the attempt to prevent social collapse, okay? So how do we do that? Okay, so I'm going to give you one or two pointers, and they are pointers, right? In other words, there's no guarantee. But we're not looking for guarantees. What we're looking for is how we can design civil resistance, given that civil resistance is now the only option. Okay, so I'll give you one or two pointers. They're not necessarily exhaustive, and they're certainly not deterministic, right? They're not going to make sure that you win. They're just going to increase the probability. So the first one is a civil resistance culture which has an absolute commitment to non-violence. There's plenty of research that says if a movement is ambiguous about non-violence, then violent elements come within it and then they destroy it. In other words, it turns towards a civil war scenario. A classic example is Syria, of course, over the last few years. Now, I'm not making any moral judgments there. I'm simply saying that if a violent rationale enters the movement, then it's like it will push out the non-violence. Now, that's not an absolute point. Lots of people can point to historical episodes where there was violence on the margins, and that's normal, right? Because you can't totally determine, civil resistance. This is the messiness of history. We all know with Martin Luther King that there were riots on the edges and people throwing stones and people with guns and all the rest of it. But the substantive point of the Martin Luther King civil resistance methodology was it was substantively non-violent, and it succeeded because it was substantively non-violent. And if you don't understand, if you don't want to accept that, it'd take me like several hours to go through all the data. But that's the understanding of the top social science on it. And if you want to deny that, then I would suggest then you're similar to a climate denier. You're just not looking at the evidence. So that's one thing. The second thing is to have a congruent leadership structure. In other words, it's quite easy to bring down a government. It's quite easy to put a government into the room. Where there aren't people in the room to negotiate, then you start to get disintegration of the movement and a slide towards chaos and violence. This is very difficult for the horizontalist culture of the last 30 years. Like horizontalist cultures, i.e. lots of people coming together without a formal leadership structure, has a massive advantage. It's ethically attractive, and it's also very effective at creating mass civil resistance upsurgences, not least because of social media, as we saw in Tunis and Egypt. The big downside is the day after the revolution, as it were, as you've alluded to, what happens next? So, for instance, in the French uprising of 2018, they were massively effective at getting the attention of the nation and creating stopping legislation from going through. Well, they didn't have a strategy, and they didn't have a leadership that was going to promote that strategy. We all know there's loads of downsides to leadership, but in a crisis, you need a leadership. And yes, they may get shot, but that's better than not having any leadership. Because if you have no leadership, then you get chaos, and you can't actually take over the system. So again, we're not talking about utopianism here. We're talking about maximizing probabilities. The third thing I would say is an effective mobilization structure. In other words, a mobilization structure that embeds people in the culture of nonviolence and creates organized resistance. This is very different to a million people, getting up one morning and going into the center of Washington, DC or Tahrir Square. That's very difficult to organize. It's very difficult to create any aggregation of demands. It's very difficult to maintain nonviolent resistance. So we know how to do that. The literature's out there. Extinction Rebellion, rediscovered, as it were, 19th century small town organizing, thousands of meetings around the country, 20 people in each meeting, 6 of those people sign up to do civil disobedience, they join an affinity group, they go through non-violence training, they have a commitment to a certain way of operating, and a date is set, and everyone goes to the city, and everyone sits in the roads, the motorways, in small groups, and you maintain a solidity of approach, which incidentally is a very ethical sort of design, because if people are on their own, they're more likely to be picked off, they're more likely to suffer from mental illness and all the rest of it. You need to have support structures and all that stuff. So there's probably another 10 things I could tell you about, but for the sake of argument, those are the fundamentals. An absolute commitment to non-violence. What was the second one I said?
Leadership, a coherent leadership.
And a concrete organized method of mobilization.
Yeah, no, this is so good, Roger. And just in the spirit of disclosure, everyone, I've been myself arrested probably a half a dozen times for various matters of civil disobedience, beginning with the Clamshell Alliance. That in some ways, Roger, was an analog to Extinction Rebellion, but in the 70s and 80s, where a small group of people took on the Seabrook reactor in New Hampshire, and all of a sudden, kaboom, there was an ignition of other alliances all over the United States and even in Europe, because there's something about the relationship between the zeitgeist and the action itself. And I think Extinction Rebellion is an example of sort of like a perfect storm where all the factors came together. And the Clamshell Alliance was a similar experience for me. At one point, I was actually the coordinator for the nonviolence training. Once we got the affinity groups together, we brought them, because they had to be trained, because they were going up against police violence, and they needed to know how to stay disciplined, and most importantly, stay nonviolent under any and all circumstances. So I just want you, and I think our audience, to know that I come from that movement. Even though I'm convening Humanity Rising now, I come from that movement and believe, as you do, that it's not until, it's like Martin Luther King. He says, it's not until you are willing to die for something that you begin to live for anything. And I think that part of what I'm feeling in you and witness through Extinction Rebellion, it's not easy to go on a motorway and disrupt traffic. It's not easy to know that you may be in prison for what you're doing, particularly in a country like the United States, where they've radically escalated the prison sentences for anybody doing what in my day you would be taken to jail for a couple of days and then released on your own recognizance generally. And, there was much more of a tolerance back in those days for the kind of actions that now are considered felonies with extended multi-year prison sentences that they're putting in place to deter the actions of climate activists and so forth and so on.
Yeah, I think you're drifting onto progressive stroke left defeatism there, right? Subliminally.
No. It's to say that there's a history here, there's a lineage here of people.
Oh yes, I agree
like
with
yourself that are willing to.
I agree. I agree. As you said, we're all standing on the shoulders of giants, right? I mean, I'm just who am I? I'm just a Welsh farmer, right? I'm just looking. I've got a talent for analysis, let's say, and all I'm doing is putting together the jigsaw pieces of previous success, and integrating that into the uniqueness of this particular moment.
Exactly.
But I think, like, when we have these discussions, and I've had, the reason I'm being a bit sort of annoying with you is I've done hundreds of these interviews, right? And after a while, you get to know what the questions are. One of the questions is is, okay, so it might not work, right? So we've dealt with the underlying assumptions between that. And there's another question, which is, hey, here in Italy, it's not like the UK, it's really hard, the police beat you up, they, X, Y, and Z.
Whoops.
And the subliminal assumption is what I call sort of materialist defeatism. Right? Doesn't understand, of course, is that we're not material beings. We're spiritual beings, or we're at least beings with a spirit, right? We don't need to get into some big argument about our fundamental nature. But what we can establish is we're not calculating machines, which ironically is what the left does. They absorb the logic of the capitalist, reductive ethic, which is, if it's nasty, people won't do it. Well, that's wrong on two counts. The first count, which is a more controversial account, is people actually like danger. They like going into conflict. They like dancing with death because it makes them feel alive. It gives them purpose. It gives them identity. So there's a large part of human psychology that supports that. And of course, that's a bit of a taboo on the left because, it's associated with Nietzsche and people like that. But it's absolutely empirically robust. People don't want to have quiet lives. They don't want to take the path least traveled. I'm not talking about everyone, but there's a significant minority. And it's that minority that changes history. So that's the first thing to say. The second thing to say is the bigger the repression of the state and the authorities, the more likely civil resistance will be successful, or at least it has no effect on the probability that civil resistance will be successful. Now that completely transgresses the materialist logic of the defeatist left. What the defeatist left goes is, we're in America, it's getting worse. Like you had those two people that were shot and the guy got let off. And I read some articles, in the left-wing press, and you know how it goes. It goes, this is terrible. It's an outrageous injustice. These people this goes back to our history of oppression and all these terrible things happening, and it's structural, which of course is all correct. But the underlying logic is therefore we're powerless, which is absolutely not correct. I mean, this guy doesn't say it explicitly, but by not challenging it, he creates this narrative, this culture of disempowerment. What he needs to say is, this is an outrage. This is part of structural racism going back, hundreds of years. He needs to do the analysis, absolutely. And at the same time, he needs to say, and the worse it gets, the more likely it is that people will rebel, and the more important it is to rebel, and the more likely it is we'll win, because we have to win. And I'm just going to stop writing articles for The Guardian, and I'm going to join the resistance, right? That's the 20th century model, yeah? It's like, I'm going, you can say at the end of this interview, I'm going to, I'm doing this Humanity Rising thing, right? And I'm going to now go into civil resistance. And this is the logic of the mid-20th century. It's like, you're going into resistance against Hitler, whether you're a journalist, whether you're an academic, whether you're, a carpenter, because it's your absolute moral duty. Now, once you've beaten Hitler, then you go back to your own quite valid, vocation. No one's got a problem with being an academic. No one's got a problem with, being a carpenter. No one's got a problem with being a host on a TV, a podcast. That's absolutely vital. We're not looking at destroying society. But what we're saying is, in 2021, you have an absolute obligation to enter into civil resistance and to drop everything else. Because if you don't, then everything's going to be lost, including all your vocation. You see that's the uniqueness of this moment. We're not saying, hey, there's a nuclear power station on the East Coast and we need to do something about it. That's terrible, but there's no necessary moral imperative to get involved. Maybe you should, and it's important, and you're going to get some people because it's a finite threat. You know, I mean, arguably it's a massive finite threat because, you know, if you have a nuclear explosion, that's going to be a major problem. But when you're facing an infinite threat, and as I said, the nearest historical analogy is the mass resistance to Hitler, then you have an absolute obligation to go into resistance. For instance, like Hannah Arendt in 1934, you know, the famous Jewish German philosopher, she said in 1934, which was way before all this got out of hand, she said, you're in resistance against Hitler or you're in complicity. And really, that's my message. You know, I can give you lots of nice little academic, you know, bits and pieces. But the fundamental point here is we have to enter into civil resistance. Everyone listening to this has to enter into civil resistance, or you're in complicity with the greatest evil in the history of humanity. And I'm not being rhetorical. I'm being absolutely serious. And that's how every future generation for the next 100,000 years, assuming the human race lasts that long, will look upon the 2020s. That's what 3 to 4 years to determine the future of humanity means, right? Mm-hmm. You see, you know, you take that in, you go, oh, it's 3 to 4 years to determine the future of humanity, you know, as if it's some sort of science fiction novel. It's not. This is like a top world scientist saying, you've got cancer, if you don't act, you're going to die, right? It's as serious as that. If you don't act, the whole of America, the whole of the Western world, the whole of the global South is going to enter the biggest shit show you can imagine. It's as serious as that, isn't it? I mean, that's what it means.
Yeah, yeah. Well, within that context, Roger, and I really appreciate your responses to these questions. And before we broaden, I want to bring Shelley Alcorn in a moment, but I'd love to have you speak to your 6-month plan. I've seen a number of YouTubes where you're actually putting out there that the action is not only urgently necessary, but if we work in a concerted way with the nonviolent discipline, the leadership structure, the right strategy for mobilization, we can actually transact the change in a relatively short period of time. And I think that's a really important point as well to bring in, that we don't have more than 3 to 4 years. But if you look at the history of civil disobedience and direct action, there are examples of where concerted action really had the kind of effect in a very short period of time. So speak to us about it, both in terms of historical precedents and what you, as you view it now, would say that we should be collectively engaging in as we say, look at between now and the end of 2022. What can we do? What would you say?
Well, the first thing to understand, and I'm going through a few of these points several times because it takes a while to break out of the culture of disempowerment that we all inherit, right?
Sure.
But people say to me, it's terrible, Roger, we've only got 3 to 4 years. We'll never do it, right? And I swap that round and say, no, you know, as an award-winning social scientist, we're going to do it because we've only got 3 to 4 years. You see what I mean? This is a completely different logic. In other words, people will rebel because we've got 3 to 4 years. The deadline is its own salvation. And I'm not saying that's an absolute, right? There's nothing overly deterministic about it, but I'm saying it's the actuality of that mass realization. We've only got 3 to 4 years, which provides the psychic, emotional, spiritual space in the collective psyche for mass civil resistance, okay? So in other words, you've got the potentiality, you've got the zeitgeist, you've got the sense of emergency. So what you're asking me is how you translate that potentiality into actualized historical form, as you might say, okay? So in my video, which whatever it's called, How to Stop the Climate Crisis in 6 Months, which everyone can watch because there's loads of detail in it, basically I'm like a messenger trying to communicate to the global public, or at least the Western world global public, how this actually works at this point in time in November 2021. So it's provisional, you know, if we get new data, we're going to swap this around a little bit. And it's an aggregation, as you might say, of lots of good best practice. And I boil it down to several key points. So obviously this is an oversimplification. As I say, you know, if viewers are interested, they can look at it, and it's not the final word. It's an ongoing project of global collective intelligence, as you might say. Okay, so my understanding of how this is working at this moment in time is number one is you start with a few people. So I've covered this. Like lots of people go, oh, you know, we need to change the government. We need thousands of people. No, you don't. That's incorrect social science. How movements start is a very few number of people, and they do two things. They work out a credible strategy and they establish their leadership of that strategy. They say, this is what we're going to do. This is who's in charge. If you don't like it, you can go somewhere else. In other words, they create a coherent strategy and a coherent central decision-making structure. That's the first thing. The second thing is they have to go and act. Like how you mobilize people is through action. You don't come on this call, like this call's pretty dysfunctional, like all calls, because people just hear it. And 99% of the people who listen to this call will just go away. You know, the reason I do it is I've got 50-50 chance that 1% of people will go and act, right? But as a general rule, words are useless. Information is completely dysfunctional at this point in history. What those people have to do is go and act in an Insulate Britain sort of way, in a Freedom Rider sort of way. In other words, they have to do whatever is non-violently necessary. So they go out and disrupt the society as a small group, 5, 10 people, 20 people, 50 people, 100 people, that sort of number, and they end up in prison as a general outcome. Maybe in harsh, in harsh situations, some of them might die. In a less harsh situation, maybe they just get arrested. Who knows? But the general situation is they massively transgress their society. And the act of that transgression then creates the potentiality for mobilization. That's recruitment and absorption into a second iteration. Now, the fundamental point here is most people that are called to do high-level civil resistance in an early stage are not great mobilizers. You know, they're usually driven by their conscience, their religion, their personality structure, but they need to be fused with what you might call high-level centralized mobilization management. That's a different mindset. What those people do is, for the sake of argument, create a national Zoom call every time that people are blocking the pipeline or blocking central, Washington, D.C. So, and that's put on all the social media, all the publicity. So people look at it and they don't go, oh my God, someone's doing something. They go, oh my God, some people are doing something. And there is the Zoom link. They go on the Zoom link, and then there's a whole bunch of good practice that gets them into, a non-violence training space and into affinity group. But you have to have that mobilization system up and running coincidentally with your action. So many people do massively effective prophetic action, right? Massively impressive, rather, prophetic action. They break a pipeline or whatever, but nothing happens because there's no mobilization system. So you can't underestimate the importance of the micro design of pathways to action. And you can read the social scientific literature on it, that this is a generic point. If you want people to do something, you've got to show them the path. You can't just convince them. Okay. And then the next thing is they then have an iteration of mobilization, action, and then mobilization. So you go out with your 10 people, you mobilize, you go out 2 months later with your 100 people, and then you go out 2 months later with 1,000 people. And during that mobilization, 10,000 people come on the street, and you end up creating some change. So as I said, this isn't airy-fairy. It happens almost all the time. There's no guarantee, of course, that you're going to get to your win, but it's going to maximize the probability. And the last two elements is to have a demand. You have to have a concrete demand, right? This is at an early stage of a civil resistance process. There's a concrete demand. So, there's desegregating state buses. There's, a small increase for Bombay workers when Gandhi went to India in 1916. There's insulate the houses of the poorest people in Britain with Insulate Britain. What that means is you're asking for something that every right-minded person agrees is a good idea. No one in Britain thinks insulation is a bad idea. You know, they just disagree with the idea they have to do it or with the tactics. And what that means is then you can frame a demand which is winnable. In other words, the demand initially has to be a rubbish demand, which is really small, because that enables the opposition to concede to a demand. And this is the critical moment of nonlinear takeoff on a civil resistance episode. In other words, if people see around the world a success, it has a massive nonlinear effect upon mobilization. And this is how all revolutions start, right? 1968, 1917, 1848. It's always the same. It's what's called the demonstration effect. You saw it in 2012, started in Tunisia, went to Egypt, Syria, blah, blah, blah. So what we're looking at is a critical mass of some people in a Western democracy gaining a concrete victory. And then my prediction is if we've got our ducks in a row, that will lead to well-organized, leadership-led mobilizations in all the Western democracies over the next year or so. And that's basically how we stop the climate crisis in 6 months. And again, to emphasize, this maximizes the probability, right? It's not a guarantee. It's just massively more effective than anything else we know at this moment in time.
Yeah, based on everything we know about social change and history, what you're laying out has the highest probability of reaching success.
Yeah, and this is I want to emphasize, this is a collective intelligence process, right? It's informed by the history of civil resistance, and it's informed by the empirics, by the experiences of the last 2 years. That's the best model. It's not like I get up one morning and dream this stuff up. I've just aggregated it for you over the last 10 minutes. And that's why it's fluid. If you bring me on an interview in 2 months' time, I'll have a different emphasis because I'll have new data, but it's data driven. That's the point.
Exactly. Well, Shelley, I want to bring you in at this point, Shelley Alcorn, who's been very thoughtful about these matters for many, many years. Shelley, I'd love to hear any comment and any question that you have for Roger as we're beginning to wrap this up.
Well, Roger, I can't thank you enough for being here. Your talk at King's College London on YouTube, I found that talk and Rupert Reed's talk on the end of civilization. The civilization is finished at the same time a few years ago. And the thing that I've noticed, the thing that I'd like to ask you about is I read a book a couple of years ago called The End of Protest. And in it, the author was mentioning how the marches have been co-opted by the power structures that be. So for example, I've noticed that some of the events I've participated in over the last couple of years feel very, we all know we're going to Cesar Chavez Park at 10. We all have our signs. The police are ready. We know what route we're going to walk. We walk to the state capitol. We have a couple of legislators and some keynote speeches, and everybody goes to McCooney's or something for lunch afterwards. And there's just a very performative aspect to it, because it's being, I think, allowed because nothing major is going to come from it. So how do we use principles of nonviolent resistance, nonviolent civil disobedience, to sort of break through that mentality of a certain part of the climate movement that all we need to do is occasionally show up, go on the march, and we'll make our opinions known? Can you delve into that a little bit as to how do you stop being co-opted by the system?
Yeah.
And actually create the change that you need while you're mobilizing?
Well, I want to set the scene and use a somewhat simplified model of how political change works. And I want to juxtapose a reformist context with a revolutionary context. And I want to emphasize I'm doing this from a social scientific point of view. I'm not making any particular moral judgment about revolution or reform. What I'm trying to identify is some social structures, some societies and periods in history are intrinsically reformist in their logic. In other words, the society is broadly okay, like from a liberal point of view, let's say, right? I mean, obviously we can say it's terrible in many respects, but it's fundamentally coherent. And in that context, the logic of reformism is the main successful logic, which is most people are fine with the society. There's a few problems, you lobby, you go on marches, the society's open and you get reform. And there's, you know, dozens and hundreds of episodes that have brought that about. And not to contradict that, to note, and there are periods of history when a society is in a state of structural dysfunctionality with itself. So, you know, for the sake of argument, you can point to Tsarist Russia before World War I. You know, there's a strong academic argument that that society was leading to revolution one way or another because of extreme inequality, because of a superstitious, you know, dysfunctional, you know, governing class, blah, 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 right? It was heading for a massive fall. Now, again, we're not making a moral judgment. All we're saying is reformism in that context was at a minimum an outlier, right? And at a maximum, a total waste of time in terms of success. So the proposition that we're making in 2021 is that societies are not going to reduce carbon emissions by 50% by 2030 without structural disruption, right? Structural disruption is a continuum, okay? It could be 10 days of disruption and there's a massive change in government policy, or it could mean the fall of a government and, you know, a new cabinet comes in, or it could mean full-blown revolution, right? So, but what we can establish is that that's the only functionality at this moment in history, because we've got to do too much in too short a time. And it's as I said, it's nothing to do with being into revolution or not. It's simply like a realist assumption, right? And you've got people on the right and you've got people on the left and you've got people in the governing classes who all agree with that analysis, often privately, of course. And I talk to lots of them, okay? You know, basically they know it's fucked, you know, to use everyday language. Now, in those situations, in the transition from a reformist paradigm to a revolutionary paradigm or a civil resistance paradigm, you have social friction. Again, I'm not moralizing about it, but what happens is the reformist gatekeepers wish to hold on to their power and the civil resistance operators have to take it away. And it becomes a primary analytical objective to undermine the liberal reformist space, whether you like it or not. So what we have to understand about the present moment is there's two oppositions analytically. There's the bad guys doing bad stuff, and there's the reformist guys who suck up the energy to do dysfunctional activities that have no bearing. And those people willingly or unknowingly are part of the crisis. That's a really difficult thing to like accept, but it's absolutely robust in my view. So how do you do that? How you do that is a combination of framing and action. Like your framing is you're in civil resistance or you're in complicity with evil. In other words, you do what Hannah Arendt said. In the run-up towards World War II, people said, you know, you're against Hitler, you know, you're against Hitler, or you're basically like an appeaser. And you got the crisis in 1939 where the whole system flipped, right, into the total opposition to Hitler, apart from a few fascists on the edges, as it were. Okay, so that's the first thing. Our framing has to say that the NGOs are now the problem. In other words, we have to break up the climate movement. This is a terrible, terrible thing to say, but that you have to be ruthlessly honest with ourselves. The climate movement is the primary reason why we're going to hell, because it's profoundly dysfunctional. So that's the first way of doing it. The second way of doing it, which is more effective, is to move outside that space and create civil resistance episodes, which is what I'm saying in my video, How to Stop the Climate Crisis in 6 months. What I'm saying is, you go to the climate crisis, you go to the climate change space, you make your proposal for civil resistance, never say never, they're going to accept it with a deadline, and then you go, that deadline's passed, we're moving out of that space, and we're going with 5 or 10 or 15 people, and we're going to create high-level civil resistance. And that's exactly what happened, by the way, in 1961 with the Freedom Riders, if you know the story, right? Everyone in the civil rights movement was going, that's outrageous, that's not going to work, you're just going to promote the Ku Klux Klan, don't do it, don't be stupid. And they basically said, fuck you, we're going to do it anyway, because we're over it. And that's what they did. And that's how they transformed the civil rights movement into a civil resistance, culture. I'm simplifying, but broadly, I think that's correct. And I read several books on it, so I sort of know my stuff. So that's really what has to happen. And of course, the big problem is activists and people of goodwill are endlessly attracted to the false hope of the NGO paradigm. And of course, that's breaking down. And I'm not exaggerating, our continued existence depends upon the speed at which we exit that space and we enter into civil resistance space. And, that's history, unfortunately. It's not pleasant, is it?
No, no, but thank you so much. That's a wonderful answer, and I very much appreciate it. From a union household, blue collar girl in a white collar world, this is how it happens.
But you need to read your history without sanitized glasses on, right? If you read a 700-page biography of Martin Luther King, you know how much a shit show it was, right? It wasn't, hey, we're just gliding through, civil disobedience, right? There were massive frictions. Every social movement is full of massive frictions. And this is the point. They have to be full of massive frictions in order to innovate, right? It's not about being friends. It's about getting the fucking job done. Right, that's what I'm a farmer. I don't consider myself an activist, right? That's not my identity. My identity is I'm a farmer, I'm a father. I want to get this shit sorted, and then I'll go back and weed my carrots. I'm not interested, right, in this whole identity routine. I just want, and that's the demographic that we're mobilizing. Like most people who've done Insulate Britain, I mean, most people who did this Freedom Riders, right? They were normal people. They were just driven by their absolute horror of what's happening, and that horror forced them to transgress the norms of the movement they were in. And that's how it works, combined, of course, with a mobilization strategy. Because incidentally, this happens over and over again, but they don't have a mobilization strategy, which is hopeless, right? So that's where social movement theory comes in. You need to have your guys in there going, okay, so, what's the leaflet? You need all that boring backroom envelope stuffing stuff as well. But, you need these prophets, as the old word is, to sort of go out and transgress the public. And incidentally, just to finish off, you've seen a classic example with UKXR and Insulate Britain, which is, lots of people in Extinction Rebellion were going, no, you don't want to do this, you're going to put people off motorways, and then suddenly once people start going to prison, 2,000 people appear on the march, right? We're all emotionally driven. And that's the way to do it. And just to finish off, the classic text is Letter from a Birmingham Prison, right? We've all read that, hopefully. Who's the biggest enemy? The white moderate, not the Ku Klux Klan. Who are the biggest enemy? They're the NGOs, with all due respect, right? They're the enemy because they're going to stop the civil resistance episode. I mean, just look at all these people wandering off to COP26, complete waste of energy. If the truth be known, what we need to be doing is building in communities for civil resistance, 70 hours a week. That's the name of the game.
Thank you.
Roger, thank you. This has been, I would say, profound, because I think you've cut to the quick of what all of us need to take in the aftermath of COP26 in this moment of ultimate duress when we're facing the certainty of extinction unless we radically change things around in the next 3 to 4 years, as David King has indicated. And I would say, as someone who's been deeply involved in the movement and study of history, your analysis is deeply resonant with a certain truth that I think we all need to internalize, that it's come that moment when radical direct action and civil unrest on the part of the movement that really disrupts and shuts things down until people change in increasing numbers and increasing demands. Nothing less than that will suffice to save us at this moment. So I just want to acknowledge
that's
that.
a lovely summing up. So this is my final slightly annoying challenge, right?
Yeah.
You know, for the last 30 years, you do videos like this, and then you have a nice guy like you at the end summarizing it and saying that was a fantastic talk and we're all challenged and we all need to think about it. No. We're not. We don't need to, you know, what we need to do is to have the email on the screen now. You know, maybe they email you, so all the people on this call have a pathway to action, right? This is not, you know, this is not academic. It's the end of the world. So if you can put an email up on your screen now, or show it, or put it in the chat, or whatever you're going to do, the people watching this show can go, wow, that was great. What do I do now? They have an easy pathway to action. They email you, and then you can pass your emails on to me, and then I can pass them on to you know, I'll point them in various directions in terms of, you know, what's happening in the US or internationally.
Okay, done. I've just put my email in the chat to everyone.
Yeah, you're okay with that? Sorry to land that on you, but you see what I'm trying to say.
No, this is perfect. This is perfect, my friend. This is perfect. So anybody that's willing to answer Roger's call for action, email me. And
everyone.
I'll pass it on to Roger.
This is everyone. It's not anyone. Yeah. This is not a lifestyle option, guys. Right? This is the end of America. Get it into your heads, right? This is the end. It's not anyone. It's like everyone. Everyone who believes in human values needs to email that, right? Needs to email that email and say, yeah, I'm open to a pathway that's going to provide me with some sort of spiritual redemption. Because that's basically what we're coming down to here is, what does my life mean at the end of the world? Am I sitting there doing nothing? Am I being a bystander while the most obscene injustice is imposed upon the poor and vulnerable in this world? Or am I going to email that guy and see what happens, right? Yeah, that's the proposition.
That's the proposition. Roger, thank you. Consider Humanity Rising an ally. I'd like to stay in touch. I am willing to commit to direct action, and I know many of my friends and colleagues will similarly commit. So I want to thank you for the clarity and the passion with which you've spoken ruthless realism and truth. It's been exactly what the world now needs to hear, and we stand with you. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm all in service to you, and thank you so much for giving me the opportunity to speak.
Yeah, we'll be in touch.
Yeah.
All right, everyone. Well, we need to bring it to a close for now, but we've had our call for action, and we need to respond. I've put my email in there, and jgarrison@ubiquityuniversity.org for anybody who's listening out there through our live streaming partners. Be in touch. We'll see what we can do to connect you with direct action in your neighborhood as we take seriously that we need now as a people of the world to act. Thank you, everyone. Bye for now. See you tomorrow.